Hello students, welcome to our first lecture video. Let's start off by talking about what it is we're dealing with here with the subject of politics. This is an American government class, and it's one of the classes you can take inside the field of political science. So let's get some idea of what politics is. Here listed on the left are 5 different lenses that political scientists use to think about what politics is. The first one is power. That is to say, who has power? What is power? How do you keep it? What's the difference between force and authority? Who should have power? How long should they have it? And that's not an easy concept to deal with, but this is one way we can think about everything around us, that it's all about power. And every subject we'll deal with on our syllabus, whether it's the presidency or Congress, will have to do with some kind of power. The next lens or way of thinking about politics is to say it's all about compromise. Sure, everybody would like to have power. I'd like to have power. You'd like to have power. But in the end, we have a limited amount, and we have to decide who's going to have what and when. And that takes agreeing and sacrificing. And that process is the process of compromising. The third one on our list is distribution. This is a very economics-driven way of thinking about politics, but it says there's only a certain amount of water, a certain amount of food, a certain amount of sun, a certain amount of oil on the planet. And politics is the process where we decide who gets what, when, and how much. The fourth lens here is justice. You probably have a pretty concrete sense of right and wrong that you've derived from your parents, from your education, from your life experience. So right and wrong is not difficult for individuals, but the problem is your idea of right and wrong might be different from everybody else's. Might be different from mine, might be different from Fred and Sarah, whoever they are. And so politics is the process of deciding as a group what's going to be right and wrong for us as a society. And that is not an easy process. Perhaps someday a big angel with a goat head or flowing locks will descend on a cloud, and everybody on the planet will see the angel, and the angel will say, here's what's right, here's what's wrong. But until that time, all we have to figure out right and wrong is this process we call politics. And it is a daily struggle. And your involvement in politics is constantly reinventing what is right and wrong. And the fifth lens on this list is change. And that is to say, politics is a way we understand how change happens in our life. How do governments change? How do economies change? How does your daily life change? And that process is all a process of politics and political decision making. So, who are these political scientists that study? So, who are these political scientists who study politics? Well, they're people who work in universities or think tanks, and there are a bunch of different approaches to how you study political science. Some do it from a qualitative perspective, which means small case number and description and interviews. Some do it from a quantitative perspective, which involves a lot of numbers and statistics. But we are somewhat of a self-conscious discipline because we're not economics, we're not sociology, and we do a bit of both. And we're somewhat qualitative, somewhat quantitative. And I now crown you all temporary political scientists for the rest of our semester. We could begin this course by discussing the Declaration of Independence, but to really understand where American government comes from, we have to look somewhere before then with some stuff that happens before our Revolutionary War. We have this French guy, Alexis de Tocqueville, who comes to America ostensibly to study the prison system, but he ends up telling us a lot about America and why democracy seems to be working. And he says, if you really want to know about a nation, you should look to its birth and its infancy. And he says, you know, if you want to understand a man, you'd look at where he came from. And the same thing's true for a nation or a regime. But this leads us to ask the question, what is a nation and what is a regime? What's the difference between those two things? Well, here's one way to think about it. If I ask most Americans if they like the government, I think most would say no. But if I ask most people, are you patriotic? Almost everybody says yes. So what does it mean to be patriotic? If it's not the government Americans are proud of, what is it? And usually what you get when you dig around is something not related to the nuts and bolts of government, but something about the underlying values. And that's what our regime is. It's this collection of shared values that guide a population. Usually with American regime stuff we hear freedom, liberty, the things that you picture the armed forces fighting for, whatever those values are that become what the American way is, we think of that as our regime. Different from a nation, which we could define in a lot of ways. You can look that up on Webster, Wikipedia, in your textbook. But essentially the nation is that political unit that has borders and a government and all the nuts and bolts involved in us having our nation we call America. But underneath that is our regime, our collection of shared values. So Tocqueville says if you understand where this regime or American way comes from, you need to look back at the two beginnings. There's one in the South and one in New England in the early colonial history of America. And they're two very different regimes. In the South, we've got mostly men, not a lot of families showing up. A fairly turbulent, restless spirit, and they're there speculating, meaning looking for riches, looking for gold. And within 13 years of the first colony, Jamestown, being established, we have the first slave boat arriving. So slavery is pretty much integrated into the entire regime of the southern colony. Fortunately, Tocqueville tells us we don't really have to worry too much about that because that is not the regime that comes to define America. The regime that comes to define American civilization, he says, is that which settles in New England. It's from more independent classes, meaning sort of middle class people come over on boats. They are mostly families. They're homogenous, meaning they all look about the same. It's a bunch of middle class white people and families seeking some kind of freedom for their religious doctrine. I caution you here to keep believing in this fleeing from religious persecution myth. These are Puritans, as we're going to discover, and it wasn't so much that they're being persecuted as they thought they could do better elsewhere. So here's some characteristics of these people that came to New England. They're all about change. It's a new people in a new land looking for a new kind of life, a new kind of religious experience. There's a sense of mission. They're going to purify their religion and show the world how to be creatures of God. And that has carried through our entire American experience, this sense of a mission, that America is going to be this beacon of light, a shining city on a hill to the rest of the world. They have a creed, meaning they really have some serious beliefs, and that's similar to a lot of other pieces of American political history since then. It may not sound crazy to think about ideas as determining reality, but much of the world's history had proven that to be a silly idea, that it was about wealth or kings or power or the church. These people had some ideas of how life could be, and they thought it could determine their social reality. As I mentioned, what we're looking at is Puritans. Puritans, these crazy Puritans. Pretty different thing from the Pilgrims, which is who you think of when you think of Thanksgiving, with buckles on hats and buckles on shoes. The Puritans are much drabber, sort of scarlet letter, wearing gray, very strict religious people. Here are 5 essential characteristics of who these people were. Now remember, we care about these Puritans because they are the beginning of our American regime, and by understanding who they are, we understand the very earliest moments of our American way of thinking. So these are 5 subcategories, the biggest to the smallest here. The Puritans were medieval Christians, and essentially what this means is think about a stick figure being right in the center on this dotted line as who you are, and you are equally invested, and you cannot escape being part in the world and part in God's kingdom. So part in the city of God and part in this worldly city of Satan. And these two worlds are very different worlds. When you think about morality, you have God's revealed philosophy and supernatural morality, or you have the sort of natural beauty around you, the rational philosophy, thinking about the beauty in flesh and time. And we cannot escape living in both of these worlds. And for medieval Christians, this is what fills all the history books, is the war between these two sides. But if you try to escape this tension, then you are corrupting the church. And that's what they thought was happening with the Catholic Church at the time. The Puritans are Protestants. And so if you don't know much about church history, I won't bore you with a lot of details, but essentially all Christians were Catholic up until about 1000 AD, and then a whole bunch of Christians decided the Catholic Church was corrupt and split off from the Catholic Church and became Protestants. They protested those corruptions of the Catholic Church. Since then, much as the Puritans cared a lot about corruption, America has had a pretty serious focus on corruption as well. Despite the kind of money involved in politics you might think of, most other nations you need to grease a lot of wheels to get anything done through the bureaucracy, police, permits. And in America, we've always had a pretty careful eye, kept a careful eye on corruption. The third characteristic of these Puritans is a kind of Protestantism called Calvinism. So Puritans were Calvinists. Very rigorous, very strict, exaggerated Protestantism. They believed in a couple things that are interesting and might keep you up at night. One is unconditional predestination. This comes from the theology and the idea that God exists in all time, so he's already seen everything you're going to do and already knows if you're going to heaven or hell. And this just torments the Puritans. They are dying to know, am I going to heaven or hell? So they are dying to know what they're predestined to be in heaven or hell. Now that might sound kind of demoralizing. If it's already going to happen, why would I try to do good? But they also believe in this piece called covenant theology that says God has bound himself in signs. So you can figure out if you're going to heaven or hell. So what shape might these signs take? Well, the Puritans believed that if you tried new things and had success, that might be a sign that you were going to heaven. So maybe you start a new shoe business, you become a cobbler, you do really well, you have some profits, that might be a sign that you're going to heaven. Unfortunately, it also might be a sign that the devil's trying to trick you with that singular success. So one success is never enough. And if one success is not enough, and you're dying to know if you're going to heaven or hell, what are you going to do with those profits, with that money you have from your success? Maybe if you're a Catholic, you'd give it to the church, try to buy your way into heaven. But for the Puritans, for Calvinists, they reinvest in a new endeavor and try to repeat that success. And if they can have repeated success, then they feel like they might be confident that they are actually going to heaven. This piece of thinking about Calvinism, the Protestants, is a very famous theory put forth by a sociologist named Max Weber called the Protestant work ethic. If you're interested, there's a whole book about it. But it makes them very conducive to becoming capitalists, and that's part of how we become the America we are today. Another piece of who these Puritans are, the fourth category, is that you can organize a church in many ways. The Catholic Church is pretty strict hierarchy. The Episcopalian Church is almost like Catholic Light. It's a similar structure for a church. You still have bishops and cardinals and a certain hierarchy of authority. A middle way is the Presbyterian model, where there are still regional councils called synods, where the churches go and meet and think about how to minister properly to their congregations. And the third way, which is what the Puritans were, is congregational model. And in the congregational model, there is no higher authority than that individual church and that body of believers. So this is another piece of how the American regime is founded in some concept of self-governance. Right? This congregational model says we don't have to answer to any other council or pope or anybody else. What we decide for our church is what is right for Scripture. So that's the first four pieces: medieval Christians, Protestants, Calvinists, and Congregationalists. This last one is a little bit of an anomaly, and we learn about the American regime sort of in the negative here. They were very intolerant. They did not tolerate new ideas. In fact, if you had new ideas of how to interpret the Scripture, they said, hey, go found Rhode Island or Connecticut. And that's sort of how all the other states were founded. But that intolerance eventually brought them down, along with being a theocracy, which means if you have church authority and civil authority, that the church is the highest authority. The Taliban is a theocracy. Any time the church is in charge of everything, that's a theocracy. And that is how the Puritans ran their day-to-day lives. And in the end, they failed. Their civilization sort of withered away because of it. And so in the long run, we take from this a lesson as Americans to become the most tolerant nation in terms of religion, and to have a fairly healthy division between church and state.